Hello and welcome back to TCM. I'm Dave Karger, and I'm so happy to be back with Jack Willen Stewart for another documentary in commemoration of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Hello again, Professor.
Hi there, Dave. Good to see you.
Next up, we're going to talk about an Oscar-nominated documentary from 1994. It's called Freedom on My Mind. And when I watched this film, I thought, rightly so, it was nominated for an Academy Award. What do you find most noteworthy about this film and about the Freedom Summer of 1964 that it depicts?
So, this film covers one of the most important chapters in the modern civil rights movement. And the fact that all of these activities happened in one summer, the summer of 1964, lends this film incredible drama. I mean, even for people who are students of the civil rights movement, to really follow along these events and to feel them from the perspectives of the people who participated in these really traumatizing chapters. I think that's why this film was so celebrated, because it really draws you into the thought processes and the experiences, almost sometimes the day by day experiences of the activists who were involved.
This documentary covers the same events as the narrative feature Mississippi Burning, which came out in 1988, directed by Alan Parker. So 6 years before this documentary was released. But I think it's fascinating to actually hear from the actual people who participated in the Freedom Summer in this documentary. But in a way, the two movies serve as good companion pieces for each other.
Yeah, I think they do. And I think in general, because there are many civil rights kind of fiction films, and as we're learning tonight, many documentaries about the civil rights movement, and they do different work on us. I mean, there are ways that documentaries can give us maybe more facts, hopefully more facts and kind of authentic subjects, whereas fiction films can do more to try to get us to identify with particular characters and to have a kind of emotional response to some of these events. I know one issue that many people had with Mississippi Burning was that it focused on the experiences of white people. So I think it's really important to have a documentary tradition that moves beyond what the customary Hollywood approach has been to the civil rights movement until quite recently, right, with a film like Selma, to really give us a sense of the agency of Black people in the civil rights movement as core central characters in that narrative.
It's worth mentioning that whereas our last movie, You Gotta Move, had a more gentle tone, this is a more intense documentary. It has some scenes and themes that are difficult. We hear from a woman who talks about being raped by a white man when she was just 11 years old. We see footage of Black men and women being dragged through the streets by policemen or being attacked at lunch counters, at sit-ins. The movie also feels like a thriller in some ways, especially near the last act. But I like that intensity to this movie. I think it fits the subject matter perfectly.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a film that gives us a true sense of the dangers that people were facing in their everyday lives, but especially when they decided that they had had enough and they were willing to put their lives on the line to end what was essentially an apartheid state in the United States. And so I think you're right that there is something that is really moving about the way that this film takes an unflinching look at the dangers, at the threats, and especially at the bravery of the people who really, made a difference for all of us.
One thing that this movie actually has in common with our previous film is that they're both directed by two women. In this case, Connie Field and Marilyn Mulford. What do you think it says that these women were focusing on civil rights issues in their filmmaking in the documentary era of the 1980s and 90s?
Well, I think it's important that these filmmakers are recognizing continuities across movements. I mean, we know that the civil rights movement was an inspiration for the women's movement, for the anti-war movement, for the environmental justice movement. And so it makes sense that as documentary filmmakers are conducting the research for these projects, and they're very extensively researched. I mean, we only kind of see the tip of the iceberg in the finished films. But I think what we can see is that if the filmmakers are really doing their homework, they're recognizing these really deep undercurrents. And so women filmmakers who maybe, had explored women's issues in other films surely recognize that there is a connection between that movement and the movement that they're documenting in this film.
Well, there's a lot that will fascinate people in this film and a lot that will infuriate people as well. Jacqueline, you will stick around and will join me afterwards. But right now, here from 1994 is the Oscar nominated documentary Freedom on My Mind. I'm back with Jacqueline Stewart. And Jacqueline, I really took note of when Bob Moses, near the end of the movie, was talking about race relations in general. And he described it as a polarization which we are not out of yet. That was in 1994. Here we are 26, 27 years later. A lot has changed, but not that much has changed when you watch this movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a powerful observation, and to see it more than a couple decades later and reflect on the fact that what Bob Moses said then is true, that there is still so much polarization and so much of it falls along racial lines. And this is why I think it's so important to watch documentaries like these, because they provide us with roadmaps. We still need to learn about the philosophies and the strategies that activists like Bob Moses used. And so this film does a remarkable job of really breaking down for us step by step. Here are the things that we did. Here is how we address the media. Here is how we organize white students. Here's how we moved around the Black community to talk to them about voting. I mean, these are still tactics that citizens need to learn today.
For me, it was impossible to watch this movie and not think about Charlottesville or to think about Stacey Abrams and all of the amazing work that she's doing with voter registration in the state of Georgia. What to you feels relevant about Freedom on My Mind?
Yeah, it's incredibly relevant. I mean, if we just reflect on the fact that the suppression of voting rights was a key mechanism for maintaining racial inequity in the 60s and before. And obviously, there have been so many ways in which African American voters have made the difference in key elections at local and national levels. And so to look at this film now as a reminder of the importance of voter registration, and to remind us too that there are ways that everyday citizens can play a role in this, not just by voting, but by forming community around amplifying the importance of voting. I think this is one of the key lessons that this film gives us, that this has been a very dramatic history, but at the same time, it's a history that points to the fact that it's just one person at a time, one step at a time, that can build toward these larger movements.
One thing that really surprised me the most in Freedom on My Mind is this idea that many members of the Black community were very skeptical and resistant to the Freedom Riders when they would be visited by these activists. What's your take on that?
They were afraid. I mean, we know that one of the strategies that was used to suppress Black empowerment in the South was to pretend as though the locals were happy. Black people were fine with the way things were. And so if there was some perception that things changed in the attitudes of oppressed people, then obviously it wasn't coming from them. It was coming from these outside agitators. And so people could get punished in many ways for associating with people from the outside, right? People who were coming in to try to change the systems that had been in place, the racial codes that had been in place in the South, dating back to slavery. And it makes sense that folks would be hesitant. Even if they were visited, they might just kind of, as we learn, agree and act like they're going to, yeah, I'll show up. But then they're afraid to do so. So to think about the ways that the Freedom Riders and a wide network of activists were able to build trust and to get a few people to follow along, and then I can get other family members and friends, right, and other observers to think, okay, well, if Mrs. So and so is taking the chance, I will as well. Overcoming that level of fear is tremendous, and I think this film does an outstanding job of representing the fear that people were feeling and their capacity to rise above that fear.
Well, Jacqueline, I'm so glad that you're with us tonight. And don't go anywhere because Jacqueline and I have another movie to talk about. We're going to switch gears a little bit with a rousing documentary from 1982 about some pioneers of gospel music.